Hello, everybody. Dragonfire here, and it's time to get back to my NBA all-time team listing ranking. Um, yeah, I'm coming back to this series. Of course, the first one that I did was on the Atlanta Hawks, and I gave I believe I chose 15 players from the Atlanta Hawks, and I think I set forth the rule for this was going to be that it has to be between 10 to 15 players on the all-time starting list. So I would give like a starting lineup, maybe a six-man, and some additional players to come off the bench, 10 to 15 players total. But when I was doing this list for the Boston Celtics, I was really conflicted. The Boston Celtics have such a long, rich history. So we're doing team number two now. For team number one, the Atlanta Hawks. Team number two, the Boston Celtics. And the Boston Celtics have won 18 NBA championships, which is the most of any franchise in in the history of the NBA. And the only team that's really even close to them is the Los Angeles Lakers, who have uh, 17, officially 17 championships, but the Boston Celtics have 18 currently. Um, and the next highest one after that only has seven. So these top two teams, it's going to be really hard because they have such a long history. They've won championships decades after decade after decade, many multiple decades. So like, how do you balance like creating an all-time team that represents? To me, it's important to represent the history of the franchise. And the Boston Celtics won their first championships back in the 1950s, the late 50s. They won two in the late 50s, and then dominated the 1960s. We're still winning championships in the 70s and in the 80s, um, before coming back in the new millennium and still winning a couple more championships. So it's like, um, how do you like distill down the entire history of like the greatest franchise in NBA history? Like how do you narrow it down to the greatest players? So with this, I wanted, you know, um, each championship to be recognized. When I did my first video with the Atlanta Hawks, they only had one championship back when they were the St. Louis Hawks, right? But the Boston Celtics have 18 championships, so how do you cover such a vast history? So, I mean, obviously, the no-brainer here was that Bill Russell, who was a member of 11 of those championship teams, won 11 championships in 13 years, um, including the first ever championship for the franchise. Um, Dominated the late 50s to all the way down to the end of the 60s. Of course, Bill Russell didn't do it alone. He had a number of teammates who were considered all-time greats. You had Bob Cousy and Bill Sherman and uh, John Havlicek, who was there for several of those championships in the 60s, but also continued to be the leader of the team after Bill Russell retired and won some championships with them in the 70s as well. Um, the you know Who else was on that 60s team? Oh, Sam Jones is another one I wanted to mention, who was on those 60s teams. And so and Bob Cousy and Bill Sharman were a pair of guards, probably the best guard combo in the league back in the 1950s. And they were making Boston a playoff team before Bill Russell even got there. But once Bill Russell got there, they started winning championships. So, you know, um, when you think about the history of the franchise, the success they had back in the 50s and 60s, and then, like I said, that continued on even into the 70s. They were led by John Havlicek and Dave Cowens. Um, in the 80s, of course, Larry Bird, huge, huge name in Celtics history. Um, but he was a member of a big three, even though Larry Bird was clearly the best player on that team. He was a three-time regular season MVP. He did have help from the big three of the other members of the big three being Kevin McHale and Robert Parrish. Um, and then later on in 2008, they would win a championship with uh, Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce and Ray Allen being on that team. And then, of course, their most recent championship, Jason Tatum. Uh, Jason Tatum was the I think usually viewed as the best player on that team for a number of years. Jaylen Brown actually ended up winning Finals MVP for that most recent championship. So I wanted to go back and I want to incorporate like all of this Boston Celtics history into my making for an all-time team, and there were just so many different factors to consider. But I made a list and I wanted to go through. Okay, how many different players have won uh, regular season MVP while playing for the Boston Celtics, or who have the different Finals MVPs gone to? And of course, there's Conference Finals MVP, and that is a more recent award that did not exist back in the day. It was only invented very recently. Um, um, and actually, I'm not sure who won Conference Finals MVP. I'm gonna have to look that up. I did not see that for um, their latest championship run. I'm pretty sure it was either Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown won Conference Finals MVP. I forgot to write that down. In their most recent championship run. But one thing that, if you look into the history of Finals MVP, you'll find out is that the first Finals MVP wasn't awarded until 1969, which would have been the very last finals that Bill Russell ever played it. Bill Russell's final championship season and his finals his final before he retired was 1969 NBA Finals, which Celtics won for the 11th time, the 11th Celtics championship. But Bill Russell wasn't awarded Finals MVP that year. Neither was um, anyone on his team, even though they won for the only time in NBA history, the first ever Finals MVP, and the only time that a Finals MVP has ever gone to a member of the losing team. So, yeah, Jerry West was given Finals MVP despite being on the losing team. Um, so, so Bill Russell never won Finals MVP, but he never, even though he has the most championships in NBA history, never won Finals MVP. Um, Mostly because the award just simply didn't exist back then. Um, who knows how many he would have won had the award existed, and I think it was an exception to the rule. They were still trying to figure out how the whole Finals MVP thing was going to work. I think that first season, 1969, when Jerry West of the Lakers won the Finals MVP despite being on the losing team in the finals. Um, I think that it was, yeah, they were still just figuring out the award. So, um, if the award had been created sooner, maybe they would have given it to a member of the winning team. But um, in '68, the ABA, who they were competing against at the time, had created what was known as the playoff MVP, and clearly, Finals MVP created by the NBA uh, was their kind of answer to that of trying to create their own version of the ABA's playoff MVP. Okay, so this was a tough franchise. Like, how do you arrange all this? How do you get all these guys onto a team? So here's what I did. First off, for my starting center, I chose Bill Russell. I've seen him listed as 6'9" or 6'10" or 6'11", whatever. I think the source I had said 6'10", 6'10" center, um, 11-time NBA champion, and 5-time MVP. He won 5 MVPs, while the majority of his career competing against Wilt Chamberlain. Um, he won 5 regular season MVPs. So who knows how many times he would have won Finals MVP if the award had existed back then? Would he have won? Um, would he have won? Uh, uh, what do you call it? Defensive Player of the Year. If the award had existed back then, would he have won? Conference Finals MVP if the award had existed. Who knows? But he is my pick for the greatest Boston Celtic of all time. I just think that when you're talking about the greatest player for a particular team, you have to take into account team success, because that is the goal of the team itself, is to win as many championships as possible, to be as successful as possible as a team. So what player represented team success the most? Yeah, Bill Russell may have had many Hall of Famers on his team. He may have had a lot of help. So some people dispute, like where he should stand among the all-time greats, because they say, championships are won and lost by teams and not by individual players. You can certainly make that argument. Uh, but he is a 5-time regular season MVP, which is tied for the second most in NBA history. Um, so I just think you can't like underestimate his impact. They didn't win a championship before Bill Russell got there. They had never been past the conference finals. Um, and the season before Bill Russell showed up, I believe they only made it to the conference semifinals. But when Bill Russell showed up, they immediately went from that conference semifinal the year before to winning their first ever championship, or going to their first ever NBA finals and then winning their first ever championship. So, um, yeah, so you can't underestimate the impact that Bill Russell had. Let's also not forget that even though the Celtics still had John Havlicek after Bill Russell retired, for the first 2 seasons after Russell's retirement, the Celtics missed the playoffs. So they couldn't find that cohesion, that team chemistry that they had with Bill Russell after he retired. Um, like I said, they go from winning 11 championships in 13 years and making the conference finals 13 straight times, um, to missing the playoffs 2 years in a row without Bill Russell. So that's pretty crazy to think about. All right. One of the very few times in NBA history that the defending champions failed to make the playoffs was in 1970, after Bill Russell retired in '69. So I'm giving Bill Russell as the center for my all-time team, and also my pick as the greatest Boston Celtic of all time. All right, let's talk power forward. I'm putting in Kevin Garnett. Now, This was really one of the toughest decision, maybe the toughest decision for my starting lineup. Um, this was hard. I went with Kevin Garnett, but I could have easily just I could have put um, Kevin McHale as my starting power forward. I could have put um, I could have put in Dave Cowens as a as the power forward. He played some power forward and some center during his career. I could have put Robert Parrish as the center and moved Bill Russell down to the power forward spot instead of the center spot. So I considered a bunch of options for the starting lineup, but I really feel like um, Bill Russell and Kevin McHale as the two, or excuse me, Bill Russell and Kevin Garnett as the two big men down low. I think would just be a great combination. Um, and yeah, no disrespect to Kevin McHale or Robert Parrish or Dave Cowens or anyone else I could have put in that spot. There were plenty of options. I just felt like Kevin Garnett was the best choice for that. And representing with some younger, newer players on the starting lineup, representing that 2008 championship team for Kevin Garnett. Um, I put Larry Bird as my small forward. Now, this is I think some people would want Larry Bird for to be the pick for the greatest Boston Celtic of all time. Um, I mean, he won two Finals MVPs and three regular season MVPs, and was perhaps the greatest player of the 1980s. Uh, Celtics didn't win as many championships as the Lakers in the 80s, but a lot of people would argue that the Lakers only won more championships because they were, the better overall team, whereas Larry Bird was actually a better individual player than than anybody else in the 80s or any of the Lakers or teams that he competed against. Um, and that, if he hadn't had such tough competition with the Lakers, Magic Johnson, all that, Larry Bird probably would have won even more championships and MVPs and whatnot. But I just, I no disrespect to Larry Bird. Obviously, he's on the starting lineup. He's my small forward. I think he would work great together with Kevin Garnett and Bill Russell. Um, but I couldn't justify making him the top pick. I know some people would say he played in a tougher era, um, and that's great. But I just feel like Bill Russell accomplished more. But this is going to be a great team because the Celtics, the reason I think they have the most championships in NBA history is they've always had players who've been willing to work together as a unit, as a cohesive unit, and it hasn't been about one player padding the stat sheet or anything like that. And I think that they've the Celtics have always played more team basketball, and that's why they've won so many championships. So I think this team would work together well. For my shooting guard, I chose John Havlicek. Um, Havlicek was there for 8 uh, Celtics championships. He won the last 6 of the 1960s alongside Bill Russell and Sam Jones and all those guys who were there in the 50s and 60s. He was there for the end of that run for 6 championships at the end of that run. Um, and then he was able to help rebuild the Celtics in the 70s after missing the playoffs. In the early 70s, they would return to being a playoff team in the mid 70s and win 2 championships in the mid 70s. So 8 championships altogether, but alongside guys like Dave Cowens and stuff, he really made the Celtics a powerhouse in the mid 70s. Um, and I'm putting him at my shooting guard spot. And for my point guard, I'm choosing uh, Bob Cousy. Now I know this is going to be a pick that, well, not a lot of people are going to like. He played in the 50s and early 60s. He's part of some of those early championship teams, but he had the Celtics making the playoffs even before Bill Russell arrived. After Bill Russell arrived, they started winning championships together. Bob Cousy and Bill Russell were two of the best players in the league. Bob Cousy um, won uh, one of the first MVPs ever awarded. Um, he might have been a multiple time MVP if the award uh, had been given out sooner. So he won one of the very first ones awarded in the mid 1950s for regular season MVP. But like I said, if the award had been created from the beginning of Bob Cousy's career, he possibly could have won more regular season MVPs. He was that good in the early to mid 50s and late 50s and beginning of the 60s, where I think he could have been an MVP candidate earlier in his career. Um, but he is a one-time MVP, six-time champion, and he led the league in assists 8 times. So he was the greatest passer of his era. Um, so yes, 8 times leading the league in assists. He's going to be my starting point guard. He's going to distribute that ball because John Havlicek, Larry Bird, yeah, are going to be the big scorers for the team. Kevin Garnett and Bill Russell will be secondary scorers, but primary scorers are going to be those two, John Havlicek and Larry Bird. And this team is going to be monstrous on defense. Bill Russell, Kevin Garnett, Larry Bird, and John Havlicek could all play excellent defense. All right. So for my sixth man, I'm going with Paul Pierce. He won Finals MVP for the 2008 um, championship run. If you ask me, Kevin Garnett was probably the overall MVP of that team. But Paul Pierce played especially well in the finals. Um, Admittedly, Kevin Garnett may have been a little past his prime by the time he left Minnesota and went to Boston, but he was still a really good player. Minnesota had failed to build around him for so many years. He finally went to Boston and they put a championship team around him. But Paul Pierce was a huge part of that championship in 2008. Okay, now for the rest of my bench, I'm going to tell you that I did not stick to 15. This was so hard because my rule was going to be a maximum of 15, but I just felt like I could not leave some of these players off. Um, so I went ahead and did 18. I figure if you could win 18 NBA championships, then you get 18 players on your all-time team. So um, I'll just read off the rest of the list here, starting with my number 7. And these aren't really in any particular order from this point down, but some great players here. So Robert Parrish, a huge part of those championships in the 1980s. He did a good enough job challenging Kareem Abdul-Jabbar during the times that the Lakers and Celtics played each other. Um, so back in the 80s. Um, so it was an important part of those championship teams. And also, along with that, you got Kevin McHale. Um, great, great power forward, great footwork down low, great footwork for like a 6'10" big man. Unbelievable. Like I said, I considered, Robert Parrish for this and Kevin McHale both for the starting lineup. Ultimately went with Kevin Garnett instead. But all right. Next up, I got Sam Jones. he was a huge part of those championship teams. He was there for 10 of the 11 championships that Bill Russell won. He's another guy who I could consider for the starting lineup as a possible shooting guard. I ended up going with John Havlicek instead, but Sam Jones would have been just as good a pick. Um, I said he was there for 10 of the 11 championships that Bill Russell won. Earlier on in his career, he was coming off the bench. Um, he came in. He came into the league 1 or 2 years after Bill Russell, but was there for Bill Russell's second championship, all the way down to the final one. He missed the first championship team, but like I said, the first few years he was coming off the bench with Bob Cousy and um, Bill Sherman playing guard, but he worked his way up into the starting lineup after Bill Sherman retired. So, uh, Dave Cowens, again, those championships of the 1970s, the mid 1970s, would not have happened without Dave Cowens. John Havlicek, I don't believe, could have done it entirely on his own. He needed another superstar player like Dave Cowens. And Dave Cowens is a one-time MVP in his own right. Um, Bill Sherman, again, I've talked about this guy before, but in the 50s, he was a big part of what kept the Celtics competitive in the playoffs, and was a member of the first 4 championship teams before he retired. Um, After they started winning championships when Bill Russell arrived. But Bill Sherman, an underrated player, kind of forgotten player in NBA history, but he was one of the greatest of his time. Next, I'm going with JoJo White. He did win a championship with the Celtics in the 70s, and he actually won Finals MVP, or he was there for both championships and won Finals MVP one of those 2 years. Cedric Maxwell, another guy who won Finals MVP um, uh, during the 80s with the Celtics. Um, he's probably the reason why Larry Bird only has 2 Finals MVPs instead of 3 Finals MVPs, because he played so well in that one Finals that he ended up winning Finals MVP one of those years. Okay, Jaylen Brown um, and Jason Tatum, I both have on the list as well. Um, these 2 guys in this most recent championship run, Jason Tatum arguably had been the best player on the team for a number of years. A really good Celtics team. Finally took them to a championship with Jaylen Brown winning Finals MVP during that championship season. But to me, they're like a tandem, a duo, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And for my final few spots here, I decided to go Dennis Johnson, Danny Ainge. They were such a big part of those championships in the 1980s. Arguably one of the greatest teams of all time with the 86 Celtics. And they had the lineup of Dennis Johnson, Danny Ainge at the guards, Larry Bird and Kevin McHale at the forwards, and Robert Parrish at center. Great championship run that year in 86. And I've also got Ray Allen on my team. Mainly wanted to get him on here for his three-point shooting, but definitely contributed a lot to the 08 championship team. So here's my list if you want to look it up and down here. But yeah, Bill Russell, Sam Jones, John Havlicek. I mean, just so many great championships with these players here. So anyway, that is my list for the greatest Boston Celtics of all time. And, if these teams were to play each other, I think the Boston Celtics would have a really good chance of of winning a tournament, becoming the greatest franchise in NBA history. I mean, they have the most championships. All right. Uh, have a great day, everybody. Dragonfire out.